The year was 1943, and the train screeched to a halt at Camp Swift, Texas. The night air was heavy with dust and the faint scent of mesquite. German prisoners of war, many still wearing the tattered remnants of Afrika Korps uniforms, stepped down from the cars under harsh arc lamps. Their eyes darted to the barbed wire, the armed guards, the barking dogs. Every man braced himself for humiliation. They expected straw on cold wooden floors, perhaps lice-infested corners, or punishment cells. What they found instead was something that silenced even the loudest whispers in their ranks: rows of wooden bunks neatly lined, each fitted with a mattress, a pillow, and sheets that smelled faintly of soap. The sheets themselves were ordinary by American standards, white cotton, creased from folding, but to men who had marched across the deserts of North Africa, slept in bombed-out shelters, and endured filthy barracks in Italy. This simple sight was almost incomprehensible. Gefreiter Karl Brenner, a 21-year-old from Munich, later scribbled in a confiscated diary that his hands trembled when he touched the bedding. It was clean, soft, impossible. He wrote, a single sentence that carried the weight of disbelief. Nearby, Sergeant Wilhelm Krauss, who had survived El Alamein, stared at the beds in silence. He thought of the straw mats where his comrades had died of dysentery, in a letter never sent but later preserved. He wrote that the sheets seemed to mock everything he had been told about American decadence. The propaganda had insisted Americans were weak and selfish. Yet here, even enemy soldiers were treated with a dignity rarely afforded to German conscripts themselves. This contradiction was almost unbearable. The United States, in 1943, was producing war material at staggering rates, one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Over 8 million tons of shipping in a single year, and more than 17 million Americans employed in war industries. Numbers that made sense only when you stood inside an American camp and saw resources directed even toward prisoners. The sheets were not luxury. They were an industrial byproduct of a society capable of abundance. The prisoners shuffled into their barracks, each man glancing at the bunks as if expecting the vision to vanish. Some sat down gingerly on the edge of their mattress. Others pulled back the sheets, half expecting vermin. But when the lights were dimmed and silence filled the barracks, what remained was not suspicion, but the slow realization that the war had already introduced them to a world far larger than they had ever imagined. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The first night at Camp Swift was unlike any night these men had known since the war began. The barracks, built of pine with tar paper siding, were far from luxurious. Yet they radiated a strange order. Lantern light flickered against the wooden beams, casting long shadows as the prisoners hesitated to lie down. For men used to straw sacks crawling with fleas or bare concrete floors, the sight of mattresses with clean sheets seemed almost theatrical, as if staged to deceive them. Still, exhaustion pushed them toward the bunks. Silence settled quickly, one by one. Boots hit the floor, uniforms loosened, bodies lowered onto springs that groaned under the unfamiliar weight. Gefreiter Karl Brenner, who had fought at Tobruk, confessed in his diary that he could not close his eyes at first. He pressed his hand flat against the sheet, trying to memorize the smoothness of the fabric. Across the barracks, Lieutenant Dieter Vogt, 32, wrote in a letter draft, "The sheets smell of soap. I have not slept with such cleanliness since childhood. I am ashamed of my surprise." The letter never reached Germany, but its words later surfaced in Red Cross archives. Not all men welcomed the gesture. Obergefreiter Hans Müller spat on his mattress before lying down, muttering that it was surely infested with chemicals or meant to soften their resistance. He told others it was a trick, that the Americans wanted to make them weak. Yet no matter the suspicion, when the lights dimmed, the camp fell into an eerie hush. For the first time in months, even years, many prisoners slept without scratching at lice or coughing from damp straw. Statistics framed the moment in a larger truth. By 1943, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had delivered over 1.2 million mattresses for domestic camps, ensuring that even enemy soldiers did not sleep on the floor. At the same time, nearly 14 million American households still practiced rationing of meat, sugar, and gasoline. The contradiction was striking while families queued for butter. Prisoners of war slept on cotton sheets. As the night deepened, small sounds revealed private struggles. A man whispered a prayer in Swabian dialect. Another wept quietly into his pillow, muffling sobs so no one would hear. One soldier, Friedrich Koch, muttered the name of his wife before finally slipping into restless dreams. These were not moments of comfort alone, but moments of collapse. When the psychological walls built by years of propaganda began to crack, the dawn came with the whistle of a guard and the clang of a bell. Prisoners stirred slowly, blinking against sunlight leaking through narrow windows. And for many, the first thought was not hunger, nor escape, but the strange sensation of having truly rested. They would never admit it aloud, but the clean sheets had unsettled them more than rifles or barbed wire ever could. Morning routines quickly revealed how extraordinary the night had been. As guards opened the barracks doors, the men emerged with hair flattened from sleep, not from dust or lice, but from pressing against clean pillows. A few even looked younger, as if a single night had stripped away months of war. The astonishment was too great to remain private. Soon, letters and diary entries began to capture what could not be spoken aloud without ridicule. Gefreiter Karl Brenner wrote on 17 September 1943, "The sheets are white, truly white, like the curtains in my mother's kitchen. I lay awake to remember the smell of soap. It is an insult to what we have been told of America." He knew the letter would be censored, but even the risk of erasure did not stop him. Leutnant Vogt drafted another line for his fiancée in Stuttgart. "Do not imagine me suffering in straw or chains. Imagine me in a bed that would shame our own barracks at home." This fragment, intercepted and stored in military archives, would decades later astonish historians who traced the psychological unraveling of soldiers through small domestic details. The gossip spread faster than official reports. Prisoners joked, half seriously, that America must have endless cotton fields if it could spare sheets for enemies. They were not entirely wrong. In 1943, the United States harvested nearly 11 million bales of cotton, much of it processed into uniforms, tents, and bedding. Numbers that seemed abstract became personal when a POW tucked himself under a blanket at night. The sheer scale of production was no longer a statistic, it was pressed against their skin. Among the men, stories clashed. Some scoffed and said they would never mention such humiliations to families back home. Others quietly admitted that they could not wait to tell the truth. One prisoner, Corporal Ernst Weber, wrote in his diary that he had seen two comrades argue heatedly over whether to believe the sheets were a ruse. One shouted that America wants to poison our minds. The other whispered, "If this is poison, then let me sleep again." Even the Red Cross officials noticed. Reports from October 1943 remarked on the prisoners' unusual fascination with bedding conditions, noting that many commented repeatedly upon the cleanness of their quarters and the provision of linens. What seemed trivial to inspectors was monumental to men who had expected humiliation. The letters home were not just private confessions, they became tiny cracks in the wall of ideology. Mothers and wives in Germany read carefully coded lines, "I sleep well," or "I dream as if at home." These words carried subversive weight, undermining images of American cruelty spread by Goebbels' ministry. Slowly, in the privacy of bunks covered with white sheets, the seeds of disbelief in the Reich's propaganda began to sprout. The night had given them more than rest, it had given them words. And those words traveled further than any guard's shout or barbed wire fence. By late autumn 1943, the mattresses and sheets were no longer merely objects of comfort. They had become subtle weapons in the psychological battle unfolding behind barbed wire. American commanders had long debated how to handle the 371-683 German prisoners who would eventually be held across the United States. Official re-education programs would come later, but the first step was more practical. Even mundane, show the men a society where even enemies were treated with a level of decency they had been told did not exist. At Camp Swift, Captain Harold Lawson of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps noted in his daily log that the distribution of linens has produced a calming effect on the barracks. He did not mean kindness for kindness' sake. The policy was deliberate, rooted in statistics. Studies from 1942 showed that German POWs in North Africa were more prone to violence and escape attempts when housed in poor conditions. In contrast, American camps that maintained hygiene and order saw incidents drop by nearly 40%. Clean sheets, in other words, were not charity, they were strategy. Yet for the prisoners, the effect reached deeper. Lieutenant Vogt once whispered to a comrade that a man who sleeps in a clean bed begins to think differently of his captor. That thought was dangerous, almost treasonous. Within the barracks, men still loyal to the Reich accused others of being softened. One night in November, an argument broke out between Karl Brenner and Hans Müller. Brenner defended the sheets as proof of American abundance, while Müller snarled that they were a trick. The shouting grew until a guard approached, but by then, the whole room had heard both sides. It was not just a quarrel over bedding, it was a fracture in belief. The United States, meanwhile, kept producing. In 1943 alone, factories turned out over 136 million yards of cotton sheeting. Such figures underscored the reality that Germany could not match. A prisoner did not need to see the assembly lines. It was enough to feel the cool linen on his skin. The numbers became tactile, the economy made intimate. Small details magnified the experience. The sheets were washed weekly, smelling faintly of lye and sunshine. Prisoners noted that laundry lines in the camp looked like white flags fluttering in rows, a symbolic sight none could ignore. Some began to describe the sensation of slipping between clean covers as a kind of surrender, though never in front of guards, for American officers. The lesson was clear: ideology could not withstand fabric. The Reich's speeches crumbled when men awoke refreshed, when their first thought was not survival but memory of home. In those moments, the bed itself was the teacher, quietly rewriting loyalties more effectively than pamphlets or lectures ever could. The strategy was invisible, but it was working. And the silence of the barracks each night became proof that the war was being fought not only on battlefields, but also in the intimate act of sleeping on clean sheets. As winter deepened in 1944, the barracks at Camp Swift grew warmer from coal stoves, and the sheets, once shocking novelties, settled into daily life. Yet, with familiarity came new tensions. For some men, the comfort of mattresses and linens became unbearable reminders of contradictions they could not explain. For others, the nightly ritual of pulling a blanket to their chin quietly softened their hostility. The barracks turned into a battlefield of words, arguments breaking out in whispers long after lights were extinguished. One such quarrel erupted between Obergefreiter Hans Müller and Corporal Ernst Weber. Müller insisted the sheets were meant to pacify them, stripping away vigilance. He sneered that a soldier who sleeps soft will wake weak. Weber, who had spent a night in a Tunisian prison crawling with scorpions, retorted that strength was not measured by the hardness of straw. Their voices carried through the bunks until silence fell like a verdict. Some men sided with Müller, fearing softness. Others privately leaned toward Weber. Savoring comfort they dared not admit aloud. It was in this atmosphere that gossip took on new power. A rumor spread that Americans provided sheets to prove their superiority, to make German soldiers jealous of ordinary workers' lives. Another tale claimed that U.S. farmhands slept no worse than the officers of the Wehrmacht. For men raised on speeches of Aryan dominance, such whispers were as destabilizing as artillery fire. Statistics only widened the gap between belief and reality. In 1944, the United States manufactured more than 2.1 billion yards of cotton textiles, while German textile output had collapsed by nearly 70% under Allied bombing. Some POWs began comparing notes. One recalled sleeping on straw near Stalingrad. Another remembered frozen barracks in Poland. Against these memories, the Texas mattresses felt like artifacts from another civilization. And yet, beyond ideology, small human moments emerged. Gefreiter Brenner once wrote that he dreamt of his mother's feather bed in Munich and woke to the faint scent of laundry soap. Another prisoner confessed he could not pray at night without first smoothing the wrinkles from his sheet, a ritual that felt like reclaiming dignity. The camp guards noticed men folding blankets with military precision each morning, as if acknowledging respect for the objects themselves. These contradictions did not vanish, they deepened, and they left the men wrestling with a question that reached beyond war. Could an enemy truly treat you better than your own nation had? To you, watching now, if you were in their place, would you trust the sheets or suspect the trick? Would comfort win over suspicion, or would you cling to doubt? Share your thoughts. I want to hear how you see it. By the spring of 1945, the rhythm of camp life had grown steady. The sheets were washed on schedule, replaced when torn, folded with care by quartermasters who saw it as routine. But for the men inside the barracks, every night remained a quiet negotiation with themselves. Some clung stubbornly to the belief that the linens were bait. Others surrendered to the small luxury with guilty relief. Suspicion and comfort coexisted in uneasy balance. It was around this time that Corporal Ernst Weber began to record his dreams. In one entry dated April 10th, 1945, he wrote, "I dreamt I was home, my daughter running to me. But when I lifted her, she carried a pillow that smelled of American soap." Such confessions reveal how the clean sheets invaded the private realms of memory. They were no longer just fabric, they were symbols of safety, domesticity, and a future beyond war. For a man who had seen comrades buried in shallow desert graves, the shock of dreaming in peace was almost unbearable. Even the guards noticed. Sergeant James Nolan, a Texan who had grown up picking cotton before enlisting, remarked in his logbook that the POWs treated their sheets like contraband treasure. Some prisoners folded them neatly each morning with ceremonial care, as if repaying a debt. Others smoothed them compulsively at night, finding solace in the simple act. Small gestures betrayed deep shifts. The numbers reinforced what the men felt. In 1945, U.S. textile output peaked at nearly 2.5 billion yards, dwarfing anything the Reich could muster as its cities lay in ruins. German POWs compared notes. A soldier from Hamburg recalled sleeping 3 to a lice-ridden bunk in France, while another remembered scavenging rags from dead comrades. Now they measured time not in battles survived, but in weeks of clean sheets. But the ideological cracks widened too. Some whispered that if America could provide this much for enemies, perhaps its democracy was not weakness but strength. Others remained defiant, insisting it was all theater. One night, Hans Muller reportedly muttered, "Better a soldier on straw than a slave on silk." But his words sounded hollow even to himself. Here, the paradox sharpened. The sheets were not just objects, they were mirrors. Each man saw reflected his own struggle between loyalty and doubt, propaganda and experience. For some, the reflection was too bright to ignore. Yeah, to you, the audience, if you were torn between pride in your homeland and the undeniable evidence of dignity from your captors, what would you choose to believe? Would you hold to ideology, or let small comforts reshape your convictions? Leave your answer below. I want to know. The war drew to its inevitable close in the summer of 1945 for the German prisoners at Camp Swift and countless other camps across America. The announcement of surrender reached them not in triumphant speeches, but in the stillness of their nightly routine. They folded their blankets, lay down on mattresses, and stared at ceilings that no longer felt like temporary shelter, but had become spaces of reflection. The clean sheets had accompanied them through shock, arguments, dreams, and doubts, and now they would accompany them to their last nights in captivity. By early 1946, preparations for repatriation began. Trains would carry them eastward, through ports like New York and Boston, back toward a country shattered by bombing raids and shortages. The contrast could not have been more stark. The men knew they were leaving behind barracks where sheets were washed weekly, to return to homes where entire cities lay in ruins, where even civilians slept on straw pallets in cellars. It was not the fear of war that gripped them now, but the fear of absence, the absence of that strange dignity they had come to expect each evening. Some prisoners lingered during roll call, fingers brushing the edges of their sheets as if memorizing the texture. Gefreiter Karl Brenner wrote his final diary entry at Camp Swift. "I will fold this sheet carefully, though it is not mine. I wonder if one day I will tell my children that I once slept as an enemy, and slept well." The entry ends abruptly, as if words failed him. Lieutenant Vogt, older and more hardened, stood silently by the bunk he had used for 3 years. A guard recalled how Vogt pressed his palm against the mattress one last time before walking out with his duffel. Numbers gave weight to these moments. Between 1943 and 1946, the U.S. housed over 371,000 German prisoners in more than 500 camps, each provided with mattresses and linens according to military standards. More than 5 million laundry loads were processed across the system during those years, ensuring that even as the world tore itself apart, the ritual of clean bedding persisted behind barbed wire. These statistics may seem cold, but to the men who lived them, they became memories stitched into fabric. As trucks rumbled toward departure, guards noticed prisoners folding sheets neatly, stacking them as if offering silent thanks. One soldier, Ernst Weber, whispered to a comrade, "I will never sleep on such beds again." Whether spoken in sorrow or awe, no one could tell. What remained was the haunting truth that a war fought with tanks and bombers had also been fought with gestures of humanity so small they seemed invisible until they changed men forever. And so, on the last night before repatriation, silence fell again across the barracks. Not the silence of suspicion, but the silence of men who realized that the war had left them with a lesson they could not deny. The sheets that once mocked their pride now wrapped them in memory. A reminder that dignity could survive even among enemies. The story of German prisoners lying awake on clean sheets in faraway Texas might seem trivial at first glance, yet in the stillness of those barracks, something profound unfolded. History is often told in terms of battles, casualties, and treaties. But here we see it shaped by the texture of fabric, the smell of soap, the silence of men who realized their enemy lived by different rules than the ones they had been taught, for many. The mattress was not merely a place to rest, it became a mirror, reflecting both the collapse of ideology and the persistence of humanity years later. Some former prisoners would admit that the memory of their first night in American beds remained sharper than their recollections of battlefields. One man said he still dreamt of the faint creak of springs when he turned over in the dark. Another confessed that he judged every bed he lay in after the war against those simple American bunks. These are not grand victories, but intimate ones, quiet revolutions of the mind that no statistics can fully measure. And yet, the numbers anchor the scale of it all: hundreds of thousands of men, millions of washed linens, billions of yards of fabric produced in factories while war raged across oceans. Out of this abundance emerged not only weapons, but small mercies. Gestures that unsettled prisoners more deeply than any rifle aimed at their chest. We are left with an image both symbolic and haunting: rows of sheets fluttering on laundry lines inside barbed wire fences. White banners of surrender, not demanded, but offered. They remind us that history is not only violence and ruin, it is also the fragile persistence of dignity, even between sworn enemies.